When I was a child, there was a lullaby that haunted my nights. It wasn't the kind you'd expect, soft, melodious, and comforting. Instead, it was an eerie tune, full of sadness that drifted through our old Victorian home. My parents said they never heard it, brushing it off as my overactive imagination. But to me, it was undeniably real. The song always began just as the clock struck midnight. It was faint at first, just a whisper of a melody, but gradually it would grow louder and clearer. It sounded like a woman singing, her voice filled with a yearning that was almost painful to hear. Night after night, I'd lay in bed, covers pulled up to my chin, listening to that haunting voice. I often wondered about the singer, who she was, what had happened to her, and why her song echoed through our home. One evening, my curiosity got the better of me. Armed with a flashlight, I decided to follow the sound and discover its source. The melody seemed to emanate from the basement. Our house was old, with a long history that even my parents weren't fully aware of. And the basement was a place I'd always avoided. It was cold, musty, and filled with shadows that seemed to dance menacingly in the dim light. As I descended the creaky wooden steps, the song grew louder. It led me to an old locked door hidden behind a dusty shelf. This was a part of the basement I had never seen before. The door was heavy, made of old oak wood, with a rusty iron keyhole. And as I pressed my ear against it, the singing was unmistakably coming from the other side. For nights, I stood by that door, listening. One day, while rummaging through the attic, I found an old key. It was tarnished with age, and I immediately knew it belonged to the basement door. That night, with a mixture of fear and anticipation, I unlocked it. The room inside was dark, the air heavy with age and sorrow. In the center stood an old gramophone, and next to it, a faded photograph of a young woman. Her eyes, though black and white, held a depth of sadness that mirrored the song's melancholy. Every night thereafter, I'd sit in that room, listening to the lullaby. It became a ritual, a shared moment of grief between me and the mysterious singer. Years passed, and my family eventually moved out of the house. I grew up, got married, and had kids of my own. The memory of the lullaby faded, becoming a strange childhood tale I'd occasionally share at gatherings. But then, something happened. After tucking my daughter into bed one night, she whispered, "Mommy, who's the lady who sings at night?" Chills ran down my spine. "What lady?" I asked, my voice trembling. "The one who sings the sad song," she replied. I rushed to her room, listening intently. And there it was, the same haunting lullaby from my childhood, drifting through the stillness of the night. Desperate for answers, I returned to the old house. It was abandoned now, a decaying relic of the past. The basement door creaked open, revealing the gramophone, still as I remembered it. But the photograph was gone. I later discovered a tragic tale from the town's archives. The young woman in the photograph had lived in the house during the early 1900s. She was an opera singer, known for her mesmerizing voice. But her life was cut short by a jilted lover, and her body was never found. Her only trace was the lullaby she'd recorded on a gramophone, a song of heartbreak that echoed her own tragic fate. My family and I moved shortly after. But sometimes, on quiet nights, I can still hear the distant strains of that melancholy tune, a ghostly lullaby that binds the past to the present. And I can't help but wonder, will it ever find its peace? Rain had been pelting the windows all evening. The storm outside was fierce, almost uncharacteristic for the time of year. I lived in a small one-bedroom apartment on the third floor. Despite the compactness of my living quarters, I took solace in the quiet of the neighborhood. But that night, the peace was shattered. It began with a phone call, Unknown number. "Hello?" I said, picking up the landline's receiver. No answer, just a soft static on the other end, accompanied by what sounded like shallow breathing. "Hello?" I repeated, irritation creeping into my tone. Still no answer. Thinking it was a prank or a bad connection, I hung up, but the phone rang again. Unknown number. I answered more brusquely this time. "Who is this?" Again, no reply. Only that soft, eerie static. This time, I didn't wait. I hung up, unplugged the phone from the wall, and decided to settle in with a book. A half hour passed. Just as I was getting absorbed in my reading, a knock echoed from my door. The abruptness of the sound caused me to jump. With the storm outside and the late hour, I wasn't expecting anyone. Peering through the peephole, I saw nothing but the dimly lit hallway. Thinking I'd imagined the knock, I returned to my book. 5 minutes later, another knock. This one louder, more insistent. Swallowing hard, I approached the door. Again, peering through the peephole showed nothing. I considered calling the police but thought better of it. What would I say? That I heard a knock. They'd think I was paranoid. But then it happened. The landline, which I'd forgotten to plug back in, rang loudly. My blood ran cold. Slowly, almost against my will, I approached the phone and picked up the receiver. "Leave." A hoarse whisper echoed through the line, sending shivers down my spine. Panicking, I locked all windows and doors, double-checking every possible entry point. As minutes turned into hours, I sat in the darkened living room, a kitchen knife clutched in one hand. Morning seemed ages away. But as dawn broke, the apartment returned to its peaceful silence, the storm outside having abated. The terror of the night felt almost dreamlike in the light of day. Shaken but relieved, I decided to visit my elderly neighbor, Mrs. Jensen, who lived directly below me. Maybe she had heard or seen something. She answered the door, her frail form peering up at me with concern. When I relayed the events of the previous night, her face paled. "You heard it too," she whispered. I didn't want to believe it, but last night I heard the knocks and the phone ringing, even though mine was unplugged. When I answered, a voice told me to leave. But the strangest part, it sounded like it came from above me. From apartment, I felt a chill run down my spine as realization dawned. Whatever was tormenting us wasn't from the outside world, but somewhere much closer, somewhere within the building itself. The city streets can be lonely at night. Even in a bustling metropolis, when the clock strikes a certain hour, an eerie quiet can take hold. This was a fact I'd come to learn all too well in my time as a late-night radio jockey. Finishing my segment around 2 a.m., I'd often find myself trekking home through the empty streets. The neon lights of distant bars or late-night eateries would paint the sidewalks in their colors. But the silence was always what struck me. That silence was only ever broken by echoing steps of my shoes against the pavement. One particular night, the air was cooler than usual, and a thick fog had enveloped the city. As I left the radio station and began my familiar walk, my own footsteps seemed muffled, yet oddly amplified in the heavy mist. It wasn't long before I noticed it, another set of footsteps. They were faint at first, lost in the echo of my own. But as I walked, their presence became undeniable. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling, reasoning with myself that someone else was just making their late-night journey home. But then I stopped, and a moment later, so did the other footsteps. My heart raced. Every instinct screamed at me that someone was following me. I resumed walking, but at a faster pace, and so did the steps behind me. Trying to stay rational, I turned into a small alleyway, thinking I'd throw off whoever was tailing me. I quickened my pace, nearly running now, and emerged onto another street. The steps had vanished. Breathing a sigh of relief, I chided myself for being paranoid. Just as I was about to continue home, a voice echoed from the alley. "Why are you running?" Frozen in place, I turned to see a figure standing at the entrance of the alley. It was a man, or at least the silhouette of one, obscured by the fog. There was something inherently wrong about his stance, his shape, as if he were both there and not there at the same time. Without waiting, I ran. I could hear his footsteps again, but this time they were rapid, chasing. Every turn I took, he was right behind me, his steps mirroring mine perfectly. Running out of breath and options, I spotted a small diner with its lights still on. Bursting through the doors, I approached the counter, gasping for air. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, looked startled. "There's someone following me," I managed to say. She squinted towards the foggy windows. "I don't see anyone." Gathering my breath, I recounted the events, from the echoed steps to the haunting voice. The waitress's eyes widened in recognition. She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You're not the first one. There have been others who've spoken about echoed steps. They say it's a spirit wandering the streets at night, looking for company." I shuddered at the thought, feeling both relieved and terrified. After a hot drink and some time to gather myself, the waitress offered to call a cab. I gladly accepted. As I sat in the back seat of the cab, my eyes continuously darted outside, half expecting to see the figure again. But the journey was uneventful. Reaching my apartment, I thanked the driver and hurried inside. My heart still raced, and my hands trembled as I locked the door behind me. Trying to calm myself, I decided to take a hot shower. As the steam filled the room and the water cascaded over me, I felt a sense of relief. The fear began to wash away. It was then, amidst the sound of running water, that I heard it again, echoed steps. They were inside my apartment. My blood ran cold. I turned off the water and strained my ears. The steps grew louder, coming closer. Panic took over. I wrapped myself in a towel and cautiously stepped out of the bathroom. The steps stopped. My apartment was just as I left it. No signs of a break-in. No signs of anyone else. The only thing out of place was the wet footprints on my living room floor, forming a path from my front door to right outside the bathroom. I followed the footprints with my eyes, and they ended at a note left on my coffee table. Trembling, I picked it up. In a scrawled handwriting, it read, "I just wanted to walk you home." After that night, I moved out of the city and took up a day job. The memories of that evening still haunt me. And even now, in the quiet of the night, when I hear my footsteps, I always listen for an echo.